I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself and then about social harmony, inequality and murder. I had a flashback walking up here because almost exactly 30 years ago I was staying in what was the Hawthornes Hotel, which is now some kind of study centre, which is where the university always put people up when it was interviewing them for jobs. And I'd done my PhD and I'd had 2 research jobs and I was trying to get my first lectureship. And I wasn't very good at ironing, but they had an iron in the Hawthornes. And I managed not to burn my shirt, but I still didn't get the job. And then, luckily, they interviewed me next year and I came. Very memorable 3.5 years in Bristol. I'm a geographer and I largely deal with data. At that time, I'd just been given the tapes of all the records of everybody who died in England and Wales and Scotland that had been recorded since the 1970s. And I've been given them by the Registrar General because she'd seen me do a talk and she was very worried. And she was worried that what the tapes showed, what the data showed, was that the number of young men in the country was rising who were dying, and in particular suicide rates were rising. And this was in the aftermath of the 1980s and what occurred with mass youth unemployment, a compulsory training scheme that people were made to go on if they couldn't get a job, and rapidly, if you got to think back 30 years, at that point we were still shocked about what had just happened. We were shocked that the rich had been allowed to get richer and had their taxes cut. We were shocked that unemployment was seen as a price worth paying. We were shocked that entire cities and regions in the north were being abandoned. Bristol wasn't economically successful then. There was nothing down by the docks, it was just derelict. TSB might have just arrived, but that was a back office. And so there was a feeling of uncertainty, even in a city like Bristol. There was a feeling this is all going wrong. And to what extent is it deliberate? To what extent have they actually deliberately done this thing? That the phrase was the price worth paying for what they thought they were going to get. And it was through Christina and Dave Gordon that I was introduced to the idea of social murder, which I think was probably first coined by Engels, and you can easily find a lot written about it. It's a really useful concept. A friend of mine, when I told her what I was doing today, who's not British, said, for God's sake, don't be English and polite about it. Because we tend to be. Murder means premeditated. It means you know what it is you are doing, you know what the effect is going to be, and you want to do it. Now, if you talk about this, you've got to be extremely careful about what you're saying, because we reserve words like murder, and worst ones, mass killing, genocide and so on, fascism, for particular things, and it is wrong to use the words when the thing you're talking about is not that, otherwise you devalue the word. I looked in particular at young people dying at the time. I looked at them dying in my home city of Oxford. I was shocked to find that the most common way to die in Oxford, if you died under the age of 65, was to die homeless. But I suspect that the people who had changed the housing system in the 80s to create a free-for-all, to do right to buy, to allow private landlords to increase the rents to whatever they wanted, hadn't done that thinking, oh, this is great, we're going to get more feckless young people dying on the streets. That wasn't their aim. In fact, in 1986, Margaret Thatcher signed the UK up to the World Health Organization goals for the year 2000, which were, there's no need for you to know them, they were to halve the inequalities in health between areas in just 14 years, and to reduce dramatically the gap in infant mortality between social classes. Now, knowing that she signed that, and she wasn't a flippant person, Margaret Thatcher didn't sign things she didn't agree with. She was actually quite brittle. I'm pretty sure that Margaret Thatcher, and probably most of the men who were advising her, almost all men, did actually think that what they were doing was going to have a result that, although there might be some pain at first, within 14 years, which is quite a long time, this would be a far better country, and the people who benefited the most would be the poor. They'll be trickled down. I think they honestly did believe that. You can get releases now of cabinet papers, so you can see what they said in private, although they knew that those discussions would be released in 30 years' time. So you can see that they did want to abandon Liverpool, but Michael Heseltine, as we now know, argued against it, which is why at the University of Liverpool they have research centres named after a former Tory cabinet minister in the one part of the country that never elects a single Tory. So you can get an idea of intention and agency. I'm only going to talk for another 5 minutes, so I do want you to ask me questions, because that would be more interesting than me talking on. It's become harder since the 1980s. In the 1980s, I think you could look and say the National Front were vicious. The skinheads who were beating you up on the streets were vicious. The weird people then who argued for sending them all back to Africa were strange and vicious and nasty. But no self-respecting politician would talk about deporting people to Africa. That was on the extreme. Okay? We now have a government that is deporting more people than the Conservative government was. We have a government which yesterday told 300 civil servants that if they object morally to behaviour that's going on in a letter, they should resign on principle. And that's our Labour government. That isn't the government we've had since 2010, the coalition and then the Conservative government. So I've had to play carefully with words. I've done a lot of work on health and on dying, and tried to work out when Jeremy Hunt was the Secretary of State for Health, did he realise that what he was doing was going to result in more children dying next year than the year before? Or didn't he? He was obsessed by stillbirths for some reason, but didn't seem to be obsessed by actual rising mortality amongst children. Jeremy Hunt is not a stupid person, or at least he's managed to make a lot of money. He made a lot of money by creating a company called Hot Courses, where if you're around the world and wanting to do a master's and want to know which one's the best, you sort of type yourself in and it tells you, come to the University of Bristol and do a master's in this, you'll become rich. Anyway, Jeremy Hunt became rich. But he also said things like, you can't possibly survive in Surrey on less than £100,000 income a year, and forgot the nationality of his wife. So, and this is, there is this constant question, are they stupid or are they evil? You have to be evil to do actions that you know will cause harm, but it is possible to live in such a bubble where your advisors tell you that nothing else is possible, or that this is collateral damage, that you may not realise the consequences of your actions. In my head, I kind of line them up in a kind of squash ladder of bumbling fool, wants to do well, through to I am more worried about their motivations. And this is particularly over politicians. Let's wrap it up, if you like, with Grenfell. So Grenfell, we've just had the results of the inquiry. The inquiry limited its remit. It said, or it and those who set the remit, but I think the judge also didn't want to extend it, didn't want to look at wider issues, such as racism or social harm. There are possibly up to 3 dozen potentially pending legal cases which verge towards corporate manslaughter. It may even be possible that the government department involved might be charged with corporate manslaughter, but all that happens then is that the government department has to pay a fine, which is paid to the Treasury, which goes back to the government. Should the senior civil servant who's been largely unnoticed, who decided that it was okay not to change the fire regulations but to leave them in limbo, should they be investigated a bit more carefully over why they didn't care? What we know from the inquiry is that they made a decision at the start of the summer to shelve it all to the autumn. And you can't help thinking, because you really don't want to wreck your holidays in August. At what point do you say that your actions are actually bordering on murder? And when we tend to do it when there are individual cases where you can link directly to Baby P, famously. And you can say, this series of neglects and the fact you should have known you're neglecting. And then you end up blaming somebody at the very bottom of the pile, rather than the person who decided that we didn't need as many social workers. Or, much more importantly than that it's okay to have the kind of society in which young parents are in a position where they are very likely not to know what to do or be able to do things with children, as opposed to other countries, where you can see that because they've made different decisions in terms of their social policy, they have 100-fold differences in the number of children on the edge of the care system and needing to be investigated. I think the whole language of social harm and at one extreme of social murder is very useful to help concentrate minds, to make people realise that what you're actually dealing with when you're dealing with policy are people's lives, and what the phrase people's lives actually means at the extreme. But I think it needs to be done carefully. That's left us 15 minutes. So please ask away anything about this. You need to be careful. I think I'm always careful in what I write. Nobody's yet even informally said that was over the top to me directly. They may think it. But I do think we need the case being made stronger and stronger, and to work out which politicians and policies were most heinous in their effect, and why, and what it is that lets people with these motivations into these positions of power, and how we don't spot them. So, questions? Does any of that make any of you think of anything you want to ask? Go on.
So about the question about, like, are they evil or are they stupid?
Yeah.
What's the remedy? I suppose. What's the process then? If you find out that they're stupid, there should be a process to deal with that.
Yeah.
But those processes that should be there just seem really ineffective.
Okay.
There's inequalities and
On the stupid, which I think is very, very, very often stupid. And one great thing of having worked for 12 years now at University of Oxford, which is a conservative university basically, and meeting lots of conservatives, I'll be blunt about this, is it has reinforced my belief in the well-meaning but stupid, nice but dim Tim kind of thing. The remedy to the stupid is not having a society that becomes so deferential that somebody who talks as if they've got a golf ball in their mouth and can do a little bit of Latin or Greek, you suddenly think, oh, they must be clever, right? In more equitable societies, those kind of politicians get nowhere near politics. They just appear to be a fool. You'd never let them up. And in more equitable times in our society, we had more able conservatives. They might have been drawn from the aristocracy, if you think about the 1950s and 60s, but they weren't the kind of bumbling fools. Liz Truss would have got nowhere in the 1950s in the Conservative Party, let alone become Prime Minister. And Yeah. So the stupid thing is, how do you end up with a society that allows people who are a bit... I'm a lefty, so I try not to call people stupid or slow. But, you know, when you see them acting, it isn't hard to demonstrate that they do not get it. It's a slightly more vicious nature. You know, when George Osborne resigned and was sacked, and he went off to Vietnam, and then he fired that machine gun that he paid £1 a bullet. You know, maybe he was just letting off steam, but George Osborne had a kind of anger about him that helped him introduce the two-child policy, which certainly, 56% of our children who have two siblings, the majority of our children in England who have two siblings, have gone hungry several times in the last month for over 2 to 3 years, according to a statistic by Torsten Bell, who's a Labour MP representing Swansea, which I really hope he goes to every Friday. So the stupid, the remedy is easier. The evil you really have to be careful about using the word evil. You get into religious things about redemption, forgiveness. Can somebody change who has done something like that? Maybe our most famous political case, or just to show how much this country has changed, is the Profumo scandal. And the minister at the heart of the Profumo scandal, who slept with the young lady who also slept with the Russian military attaché, he resigned, because in a normal country you just resign. You know, it's not the 300 civil servants who are worried about genocide who should resign. It's ministers who resign. And in normal countries, ministers do resign. And in this country, it did. He then spent the rest of his life sweeping the floor in Toynbee Hall and trying to do good. Or Jonathan Aitken, who lied in court, who claimed that he had the sword of justice and a shield or something. And eventually it turned out that as a minister he'd actually lied and he was sent to prison. He tried, I think has tried, to gain some redemption by doing different things in his life. But you're on the edge of this, because you're talking, once you use the word murder, you're then talking the language of what you have to do to atone for the sin which you've been found guilty of. The danger with murder always is that it's in the head. So you can't ever be quite sure that somebody really meant to do the thing they did, right? If you're ever on a jury and you're in a murder case and you're being asked to convict somebody, it might be pretty obvious, but still, when they say, "I was very angry, I didn't know," and you say, "But you got all the stuff together a month before," but we're into that kind of territory. But also, if we want to be serious about having sanctions, such as corporate responsibility, corporate manslaughter, the potential of holding people at the top accountable for their actions, you have to use this language, I think. And I want people to be really, really careful. I want people that higher up you are to think, I might be held individually responsible. You can see them behaving like this all the time. I mean, you'll never get an email out somebody at high up at a university because they know about FOI requests and about being found out now. But I don't know. It's too long an answer, so I can go on and on, as you can tell. But we got another question, or whether you think I shouldn't be using this language, or we should. Is that the extreme of social harm? Over there?
Got a question at the back.
Trying to form a coherent question. The talk of evil versus stupid. I live in the next village down the valley from Aberfan.
Yeah.
So obviously these debates are still running and are still alive in sort of every day. It can feel very divorced in terms of what we're doing in research, and this is something that I think about quite a lot in terms of how we theorise and how people, particularly working class communities, experience those harms. And I think my question is about how to sort of marry that experience and those needs for justice, which, as we all know, very rarely come, to how we theorise in a way that remains honest to those experiences.
Yeah. My mother was hugely affected by Aberfan, simply by the news. She wasn't personally involved. She may have been at the right age. It was, I think, before I was born. But,
Could you just say what it is?
Yes.
There'll be people who won't know. So, in the mid-1970s, Wales was a coal mining area, and what looked like mountains were huge piles of coal dust, refuse from the mines. It had been a very wet summer, and the local engineers from the mines had warned the National Coal Board, which no longer exists, that the tip, this mountain, was unstable, that it was moving. And one morning, at 3 minutes past 9 o'clock, so just started the school day, it fell on a school. And it wiped out almost every child in that village.
And the teachers who were found sheltering the children. And you've got to be careful about going to places, but you can quietly go easily from Bristol to Aberfan and go to a churchyard. And the graves are linked together apart from the one on the edge, where the parents wanted murdered by the National Coal Board on the gravestone, which it is. There are lots of websites about Aberfan. They were initially, it could have been, they were offered like £5 per child. It was. So there are the stories of these places, and stories of Hillsborough and so on, and how the police behaved, and how the behaviour is different for something like the Marquiness, which was the ship that went down, but the people on the ship were fairly well off. So properly investigated, if you like. So what I've always wondered about Aberfan is whether it did have a long-term beneficial effect in that it didn't happen again to another school. I suspect engineers did worry about slag heaps a bit more than what we did with them. But I'll give you the opposite to Aberfan is a Conservative female minister, and I've forgotten her name, who rushed at one point into the lobby of the House of Commons and declared that 200 schools were going to have to shut buildings because the roofs were unsafe. And she went against the advice of some of her colleagues and some of the civil servants advising her because of RAC, and actually said these schools are not safe. And I think that was the right thing to do, but it's kind of easy to do the right thing if you spend your life doing the right thing. For a Conservative minister whose views weren't particularly nice, for her to have broken and just went, no, there is no way. And you could turn around and say, actually, none of those 200 roofs has yet fallen. But in her mind, it may have been the idea of Aberfan of what you're going to do. The sad thing is, we shouldn't be having to tell the stories of these events. You know, the next Grenfell, the next one, because we should be in the situation of better places where you simply don't make this possible. You see it everywhere in the world with earthquake engineering. You know, places which are prone to earthquakes where they do build the buildings properly so that when an earthquake comes, it's not going to kill people. And it's how do you balance the shock and horror and level of accusation versus not wanting to dull the effect by using the words all the time. But the other interesting thing, just saying, you know, it was one of two things that made my mum political. One was Aberfan, the other was being aged 15 during the Suez crisis. And watching the stupidity of the British government wanting to still keep its empire powers and the French, and being told by the Americans you couldn't do this. So these events affect people at particular generations. You go a little bit older than me, and it's Vietnam. For me, it's nuclear protests. For all our students now, I've just been up at Royal Fort Lodge where the grass is very clear, where the tents used to be, and read a little notice from the university. For all our undergraduates at the moment, it's Gaza. And that'll be the defining issue of the rest of their adult lives. I asked about Vietnam, who was useful at the University of Oxford amongst the staff at the time in 1968, and was told there was less than half a dozen academics that could be remembered who were useful. So generally, academics in the university are not useful. The most incredible protests, which I didn't know about, were the protests in 1938 by students. And in my university now, a young radical communist student called Dennis Healy brought a copy of a portrait called Guernica, which was newly created, to a senior common room in Balliol, later Johnson's College, and caused great upset by putting Guernica up. Another set of students enacted a play, which was set on Christchurch Meadow, about the creation of a concentration camp in 1938, warning what was going to happen. That set of students included Iris Murdoch, who later became. So there was a history of horror and protest and complaining about atrocities like Guernica. The tragedy, in a way, for me being old, not a single senior or middle-aged member of my university at any point has been helpful while the students have been protesting against these things. And these are posh students. You know, nobody remembers who the Vice-Chancellor was in 1938, right? Who told them that they shouldn't be doing this, warning about what was happening in Europe at the time. Similarly, very few people have actually stood up for the students who've been protesting. We had more than a dozen students arrested and taken to far-flung police cells. And if you want your student body to suddenly care about an issue, that's the way to do it. The last thing, I don't know, about the protests, about when that happened and our students were put into police cells, it turned out that they had a whole network of legal aid lawyers and so on looking after them. When it got to after midnight, at night, the signal channel, because staff who had cars, the signal channel that was checking if the students were okay and when they were being released, the administration turned over to students at the University of Columbia in New York, because the student protest camps were linked around the globe, which helps a great deal if you're sitting there in a tent getting cold and worried about university security in the cameras, if you're actually talking to students in tents in other campuses. So, looking at how these things are opposed, who is it that eventually got the proper story of Aberfan told? Who is it that keeps it alive that you can't simply yet demolish that tower, although the Secretary of State has said that they're going to? Who is it who does that? And very, very often it's women, it's mothers. The ultimate one to leave is Dorling Lawrence. Dorling Lawrence is worried that she will die before the final truth comes out about the killing of her son. Social scientists can help by deciding when you say murder and not murder, but our job is to go beyond the individual acts and not worry about the precise person who uses the knife, but the circumstances in which an entire metropolitan police force could be corrupt so that a murder becomes possible, and then the kind of society which allows that to happen, and what you have to do so that at some point in future people look back on this and say, how could that have happened? Yeah. Does anybody want to ask the last one, or have I gone over my time?
We've gone over by 5 minutes, so any very quick questions? Quick question for Danny? If there is such a thing.
With me.
Okay. Well, let's say Big round of applause.